Hello, my name is Rick Hunt. I'm Carolyn's husband, and Carolyn has been a storyteller in the Native community for many, many, many years. And together we were known as Laughing Couple. And we performed in colleges, elementary schools, powwows, conferences, you name it. We were there. Carolyn did about 10 programs with the Vermont Symphony Orchestra, singing in Abenaki, and we both worked with them at the Flynn Theater, and it was quite an adventure, since I was drawing on a drum platform on a 4 by 8 foot wall, while the entire symphony was playing. So I was drawing, and I'd look down and somebody's playing a violin and a harp and cellos and horns, and I thought to myself, I've become the Moody Blues. So we've done a lot of different programs over the last probably 11 years.
Yes.
And we've performed in New Jersey, New York, all over New England, all different kinds of venues. And of course, Carolyn had a stroke about 3.5 years ago. So we have slowed down considerably doing storytelling. Carolyn has, she experiences what's known as aphasia, which affects her language abilities, not her intellect, but word search and being able to pronounce words sometimes orally. And so it's been a real challenge for her. And I have to say that she is remarkable in her ongoing recovery from this. But this is why we can no longer go to schools and things like that and perform, because it wouldn't be the same with someone else doing the story. Right?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The first story is a historical story. It's a very old story. It's one of our first stories. And it is how the Alnomba, the people, received fire. And back in the long ago time, some of us are little, the land was covered with thick sheets of ice. And this is the time that this story originated. There were 3 women. There was a mother and her 2 daughters. They lived high up on the mountainside, where the long river flowed down through into the valley. And up on that mountainside, they had a cave that they lived in at a time when the ice was thick on the land. And these 3 women had fire. And there was a grouping of people in a village down at the bottom where under the snow. You need to make your feet like those of a grouse. But the boy did not know how to do that. And the fox said, I will show you. He took the boy to an ash tree, and he took branches and slivers of wood. And he showed him how to bend the wood into shapes and how to tie them with the roots of the spruce. And he showed the boy how to make snowshoes. And this is how snowshoes came to the people. And with these shoes on his feet, he could walk on top of the snow like the grouse. And he made good time. Soon it came to be midday, and the boy again was growing tired. And he sat down, not to wake the 3 women who were sleeping at his feet. He reached into his shirt, and he pulled out the 4 sticks. And he took the first stick, and he put it in the fire. to light it. But when he did, he lit his stick, but the main fire went out. And thinking, oh, I'm going to be caught now, he jumped over the person closest to the door and ran. And when he landed, his feet made a sound on the ground. And the woman woke up, and she saw the fire was out. She yelled, "Thief! Thief! Someone has stolen my fire! Stop him!" And the two sisters jumped up, and they saw the boy running out the door with the fire on the end of his stick. And they chased him. And that boy ran for all he was worth. Honey, yes. Bears love sweet foods. And the honey made by the bees is the sweetest food of all. And that was the thing that Bear craved above all other things. And he used to have pretty ready access to all the honey he wanted. He would find the hives of the bees, and he would smash them open and eat all the honey until he was full. It takes a lot of honey to fill up the belly of a bear. And the poor bees were so upset because no matter where they built their nests, Bear would find them and rip open their homes and eat all their food. And all the little bee children would go hungry because Bear was such a glutton. And what were the bees to do with broken homes and crying, hungry children? The chiefs of the bees all came together to have a great meeting to discuss what to do about Bear. And the young bee chief said, "We need to make our hives so strong that Bear can't rip them open. We should make our hives from the clay along the shores of the rivers and bake it hard in the fires, so it's hard as rock. And then Bear cannot break into our homes and steal our food, and then our children will not." To this day, what do beavers do? They're busy all day cutting down trees and dragging them here and there and piling up this way and that. And ever since that day when Tabalda found Beaver and scolded him and punished him for cutting down the forest, when Beaver is working hard along the shorelines and Bear comes by, they don't look at each other. Because they're both still afraid that Tabalda will discover that Bear was in on it as well and punish Bear. And that is the story of Bear and Beaver. So before we wrap up for the day, is there anybody that has any questions for us? Or yeah.
Where did you learn all these stories?
Where did I learn? That's a good question.
Yeah.
I started reading stories, just regular stories, when I was very, very young. When I was your age, I had a library card, and I went to the library every day and got 5 books. And I'd read those books, and I'd go back the next day and get 5 more. And then I read all the stories they had. And I found in the back, dusty corner of our town library, which was about the size of this room, this big old leather-bound book that had the history of the Indian people of New England. And I opened it up, and it was full of stories that I'd never heard before. Stories about Creator and the first people and the animals like I told you today. And I started reading them. And they resonated in my heart and in my mind and in my soul because I'm descended from the people who created those stories. And they felt, even though I'd never seen or heard these stories before, they felt familiar to me. And I studied them more and more. And now I have a floor-to-ceiling bookcase. Seriously, I built it into my wall myself to hold all of my books. When we make offerings to the land in our ceremonies, we're recognizing our connection from the sun to Mother Earth, who bears our ancestors. And Mother Earth is the 3rd level of creation, which we pull down below. And not only does Mother Earth bear the bones of our ancestors, it's her physical essence that gives us our bodies to live in. The essence of Mother Earth is in the physical body of the plants and the animals, the birds and the fish, the insects, even the water. And when we eat and when we drink, we take the physical essence of Mother Earth into our own bodies for our sustenance and for our survival. So this is another way that we connect ourselves to Mother Earth and therefore through her to our ancestors. And in our prayers and ceremonies, we use our drum, big drum, hand drums, that represent Mother Earth. The beating of these drums echoes our mother's heartbeat. And when we drum, we are acknowledging that we are children of the earth, and we are sending a message back to her saying, we hear you, we understand, and we recognize our connection to you. We recognize your heartbeat the way a newborn child recognizes the heartbeat of its own mother. And we do this through the drum.
My name is Doug Bent. I live in West Braintree. We're here at the Abenaki Koasek of the Koas Tribal Garden on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. And I'm going to do a story, The Water Monster. At one time, there was a beautiful river. It flowed along in a meandering path until its waters reached a steep bluff. Here the water fell in a long and magnificent waterfall. Below these falls, the water again formed a river that flowed down through a thick forest, then opened floodplains to the great water, which we call the ocean. The waters of this lower river along the floodplains were deep and cool, and it provided many fish for the people who relied upon it for food and clean drinking water. The river provided what the people needed year after year after year. However, one spring, the waters of this river below the falls did not flow as fully as they had in previous years. There has been plenty of snow during the winter to keep the water in the river well fed, yet the river seemed diminished. As spring moves towards summer, the waters continued to diminish. To make matters worse, the waters no longer ran clear. They had become a dark, brackish brown. An oily sheen rode on its surface, and it began to have a foul smell. The people grew very concerned with these unhappy changes. A man was chosen to follow the river back up to the top of the falls. He was to discover what had happened to their beautiful, clear river and bring the news back to the village. Many days passed. The man did not return. Another man was sent, but he too did not return. A third man was sent. He did not return either. The people's concern grew deeper. Several men, armed with bows and knives, chose to follow the river to the problem and find the missing men. These men also did not return. The concern of the village grew into fear. The river waters continued to degrade and diminish. Their men did not come back. It was decided that the people needed the help of their big brother, Gluskamba. A runner was sent to find him. The day of equal day and night came and went, and it was now summer. The runner finally returned with the news that Gluskamba would arrive in a day or so. 2 days later, Gluskamba arrived at the village. When Gluskamba arrived, he could clearly see for himself what the problem was. In fact, he had been able to smell the river long before he saw it, as its foulness only grew with time. By now, the river no longer flowed. The sludge it had become oozed along the riverbed. The bad odor had become an overwhelming stench. The plants that grew along the riverbank were wasting away. The crops of the people, which the river once irrigated, were withered and dry. Gluskamba was patient with the people. Even though he could see what was happening, he allowed them to express their concerns and fear. When all had spoken, Gluskamba assured them that he would find the source of the problem and restore the river to its former fullness and clarity. He advised the people to pack up their homes and gave them directions to a different river where there was some room for them to live. In the meantime, Gluskamba fed the village from his magic travel bag and used his magic to create clear drinking water for them. The next morning, Gluskamba saw the villagers off with a promise that they would be able to return in time to their ancestral home. Then, when all had left, he began to follow the stinking sludge into the forest to find its source. As Gluskamba traveled along the riverbank, the sludge continued to grow thicker and thicker. Its stench grew stronger and stronger, making even the eyes of the mighty Gluskamba water and burn. After 2 days of walking, Gluskamba finally reached the foot of the great waterfall. Here the sludge had given way to a greasy, semi-solid ooze. The smell was almost more than Gluskamba could bear. And here, at the foot of what had once been a beautiful waterfall, he saw filthy creatures moving the slimy ooze. They themselves were covered head to toe with it. They used crusty buckets to scoop up the filth and carry it into the nearby forest to dump it. Then they returned for another bucket load. Gluskamba slowly approached the nearest of these filthy creatures. But as he drew closer, the creature scuttled away from him, keeping its face averted. Gluskamba approached a second creature, but it too scurried away from him. Gluskamba then approached a third creature. He had seen it looking at him and thought he might have better luck with this one. As he approached it, it did not withdraw from him. "Who are you?" asked Gluskamba. "What is going—" "Shh!" the creature interrupted him. It sidled up to him before it spoke again. "We must whisper and hope that the monster does not hear us." "What is going on here? What is this monster you speak of?" Gluskamba whispered, as the creature filled its bucket and scurried towards the forest. Quickly, Gluskamba followed it into the dying trees. The creature looked around furtively, and then, grabbing Gluskamba by the wrist with its filthy hand, it led him behind a large soiled boulder. "I only have a moment to speak to you. We are the men from the village that lived along the lower river. Our river became sick, so we came to see what happened. The monster captured us and made us its slaves. If we do not do its bidding, it will go and eat our families. Help us, Gluskamba, kill the monster." So saying, the creature, which was a filth-covered man, scuttled back to the bottom of the falls to scoop up more of the oily, stinking glop. "What's this monster that the man has spoken of?" Gluskamba went back to the riverbed and looked up to the top of the falls. All he could see was a great hulking boulder larger than Gluskamba had ever seen. It seemed to stretch from side to side with no end. Its height was taller than the tallest pine tree. Its surface was black and oily. The filth that filled the riverbed seemingly seeped out from beneath it as it sat on top of the falls. Perhaps the monster lived on top of this gigantic boulder, or maybe on the other side of it. Either way, Gluskamba was determined to bring an end to the filth and to free the men who had been made slaves to it. He walked off into the woods, thinking to climb the bluff around the side of the boulder. But the boulder just kept going on, and as if it had no end. Finally, Gluskamba thought he could see the sky to the left of the boulder, indicating he had finally found its edge. Gluskamba climbed up the steep cliff below the edge of the boulder. He did so slowly and quietly because he did not know where, on the other side, this monster lurked. Finally, he reached the top of the cliffs. Here he saw that the boulder, while very wide and tall, was also very deep. It took him several hours to walk around its edge before he could begin to see what was in front of it. A wasted land spread out before him and away. The upper waters of the river flowed towards the boulder and into a deep pool made in front of it. Dead fish floated upon the surface of the pool, adding to the already foul smell that Gluskamba could not escape. The smell seemed to seep out of the boulder itself. As Gluskamba continued around the side of the boulder, he approached the edge of the wide pool. It was much wider than he had imagined, as was the boulder that blocked the waters. He slowly picked his way along the seeping, stinking edge of the foul pool, that he could get a full and clear look at this enormous boulder, and to see if he could catch a glimpse of the monster. He had the magical bow that Creator had given him at the ready, an arrow nocked for quick release. After a long while, he finally reached the front of the large pool, where the upper river fed into it. The boulder that sat atop the cliff was easily a mile or more wide. It was nearly half a mile high and was a squat and slouching shape. It had a large crack that seemed to split it from one side to the other. From the crack, above the crack, were two protrusions set wide apart. Gluskamba had never seen anything like this boulder before. Moving carefully, Gluskamba looked around for any sign of the monster. He did not know if it lived on the boulder or if it lived deep in the black pool that lay in front of it. Perhaps it lurked in the surrounding dead trees, just waiting for a chance to pounce. As Gluskamba was determining what to do next, he heard a loud, squishing noise. The crack in the boulder began to deepen, almost like a giant mouth slowly opening. But it did not sound like the movement of stone. Instead, it sounded like the wet, slurpy sounds of a wet and sticky mouth. As the crack deepened, the protrusions began to move. Gluskamba was stunned to see two large eyelids slowly lifting open, revealing two gleaming yellow eyes. The crack, easily a mile wide, continued to open and move. Then a deep, slick, wet-sounding voice began to speak from the boulder. So, the great Gluskamba has finally arrived. I have been waiting for you. Gluskamba realized the boulder was no boulder at all. It was the monster itself. He had fought with many large monsters before, but he had never seen one like this one. He raised his bow and arrow, aiming at one enormous eye. I have come to free your slaves, Gluskamba called out to the monster. I have come to remove you from your perch and return the river to its former health. You have no business here. Ha, ha, ha. The monster began to laugh. It sounded like boulders being ground into sand, and the sound of it seemed to fill the entire sky. My business, not your concern, Gluskamba. I can do as I wish, and you can do nothing about it. Be gone from me. I don't think so, replied Gluskamba. I will not leave here until you are gone and all has been restored to how it was before your arrival. Your filth pollutes the waters and land, making everything sick. This must end now. The monster again laughed his horrible laugh. You are no threat to me, little one. I will eat you as a snack. It was then that Gluskamba saw the monster's great tongue roll and curl in its enormously wide mouth. Gluskamba then unnocked his arrow and slung his bow over his shoulder. As he did this, he used his magic and began to grow, and grow, and grow. Gluskamba grew himself as tall as the monster itself was wide. He knew that great size was his only way to fight this foul thing. Ah, said the monster. So the stories are true. You do have magic. Even better. Now that you are large, I will eat you as my supper. Just then, the monster's tongue shot out from its mouth. It was thick and green and sticky, and it came at Gluskamba with enormous speed. Gluskamba had only seconds to react and step aside so that the great sticky tongue missed him. Just as quickly, the tongue was pulled back into the enormous maw of the monster. Losing no time, Gluskamba launched himself towards the monster. As his arms made contact with its great moist body, he swung his legs to one side, bringing his body around behind the monster and away from its lightning-fast tongue. "I will not be your supper today or any other day," Gluskamba's enormous voice rang out. "It is time to cut you down to a proper size." As he spoke, Gluskamba began to squeeze the monster with his arms. As he squeezed, the monster let out an angry bellow that shook the very land around them. "Get off me, you annoying me. I will wipe you off like the bug you are." The monster lifted one of its front legs. Its great foot had long webbed appendages that ended with sticky knobs. He raised his foot up to swipe at Gluskamba, but Gluskamba ducked to the side and the giant foot missed him. He continued to squeeze the monster, his muscular arms straining as he tried to draw his hands closer and closer over the great soft, lumpy, slick body of the monster. Again, the monster let out a land-shaking roar. Gluskamba continued to squeeze around the monster, sweat breaking out on his forehead. His hands slowly but steadily got closer and closer together. The monster's slimy body was difficult to hold on to, and now that it had started to move, Gluskamba was afraid he would lose his grip on it. The monster reared back over its hind legs, bringing its front feet up to grab Gluskamba by his arms. His grip was slimy but firm and very strong. Gluskamba struggled to keep his hold upon the monster. "Prepare to be defeated, Gluskamba. I will be the final end of you." Gooey green saliva spewed from the monster's wide and gaping maw. "We'll see about that," Gluskamba grunted. This monster was strong. He struggled to keep his grip, his hands slowly inching closer to one another. "I have you now, Gluskamba," the monster hissed. With a great heave, it threw its tremendous body backwards. Gluskamba and the monster fell down the cliff, crashing and crushing the dead trees that lay below. The filth-encrusted men barely managed to scramble out of the way. Gluskamba used the monster's very own sliminess to his advantage and swung his legs around the monster so that he was now in front of it as it landed with a great wet slapping. His hands were now within reach of one another. Gluskamba grasped his hands together and renewed his efforts to squeeze the monster. "Not fair, Gluskamba. Let me up." It bellowed great gobs of spit, hitting Gluskamba in the face. He shook off as much of it as he could so that it would not blind him. "This was your idea, monster," Gluskamba answered. "Now I will bring you down to size." Gluskamba renewed his efforts. The muscles in his arms strained. Sweat was pouring off his face. But he kept squeezing and squeezing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to feel the body of the monster begin to close in on itself. He squeezed some more, bringing one hand over to grasp his opposite wrist, continuing to squeeze and squeeze. "No! What are you doing to me?" the monster screamed. Gluskamba was squeezing it so tight that it began to feel its body starting to shrink. "Let me go." With this last outburst, water from the river that the monster had swallowed began to flow from its mouth. Gluskamba continued to squeeze, grunting hard. As he did so, the monster shrank some more. More water flowed from its giant wide mouth. Fish and ducks that had swallowed along the river began to flow from its mouth. Gluskamba squeezed harder and harder, pressing the monster's great body against his own. The monster tried to fight back, but it was unable to turn its front feet in towards its body. Its enormous green tongue flew out of its mouth and back in again as Gluskenbach continued to squeeze. With Gluskenbach clinging to it so tightly, the monster was unable to roll itself upright. It continued to flounder around, and still Gluskenbach squeezed and squeezed. As he continued to squeeze, the monster's body began to shrink. Gluskenbach kept up the pressure with his great arms, making the monster smaller and smaller. All the while, the monster bellowed the foul words and struggled to get away. But it could not break the grip of Gluskenbach. As the shadows of the day deepened into darkness, the battle raged on. The sound of the monster echoed off the nearby mountains. The sounds carried far over the treetops, causing distant villages to believe that demons were about. They hurried their children into their homes and tied their doors tightly against the strange sounds coming to them in the night. As Grandmother Moon looked on, the battle continued. Gluskenbach was able to reduce the size of the monster greatly. He could now get his enormous hands upon either side of it as he continued to squeeze and squeeze. Slowly the bellowing monster shrank and shrank. By first light, the monster had been so reduced in size that Gluskenbach was able to hold it between his two hands. He continued to press them together, squeezing the bellowing monster smaller and smaller. As Grandfather's sun began his journey into the sky, the monster was small enough that Gluskenbach was able to return to being the size of a human. The great slimy monster was now just in a ball in his strong hands. When Gluskenbach's fingers were finally able to touch each other around the body of the monster, he stopped squeezing. "There," he said, breathing heavily from the battle. "Now you can do as you like or not, be a burden or a threat to anyone." Gluskenbach released the former monster onto the dry ground. He spoke to it again. "As you have been so greedy to claim all the water as your own, your life will now be dependent upon it. Your body must always be wet for you to survive, and the water will be your escape from those that decide they may want to eat you. And so it shall be forever." The now small creature that used to be a monster glowered at Gluskenbach. When it tried to answer back at him, all that came from his wide mouth was a deep rasping sound. Grrrp, grrrp. And so it grrrped at Gluskenbach as he removed the layers of filth at the top and bottom of the falls. He restored the river in its course both above and below. He revived all of the fish and waterfowl and water insects that the monster has swallowed into his own great maw. He restored the shorelines and the forest, and when he saw that the river was once again flowing clean over the cliff and onto the ocean, he bathed each of the village men who had been a slave to the monster, reviving them to their former strength. He walked with these men back to the site of the village. Then he gave them directions to find their families. And they had been sent so they could return to their former home at once. And so the great monster of the waters was defeated. The great grandchildren of the former monster must still live in and near the water. They now prefer the stiller water of ponds and lakes. Their grumps can be heard all throughout the summer, and if you are quiet enough, you may be able to see the remnants of the great water monster hiding along the reeds of the shoreline. We call them bullfrogs today.
Hi, my name's Kenneth, and I first heard the story I'm about to recite on a show called Moccasin Tracks. It's an elusive show that I never quite know when I'm going to turn my radio dial on and hear. I may be driving, I may be sitting at home, I may be just out and about listening to it on my phone. I turn on a channel of community radio somewhere in the world, in the Vermont borders, and there'll be the day when it comes on. And a couple months ago, I heard this story recited from an archived Moccasin Tracks. Carolyn Black Hunt actually read the story, and I was like so excited by it. I was like, this is such a great story, and I got to hear some of the history of the story that I think has something to do with a sister in a thrift shop, maybe, or a present. And I just loved it. And I called Deb up and I was like, oh, I'm so glad I just heard the story on Moccasin Tracks radio. And so then a few weeks later, she asked if I'd be part of recording, which we're here today in Abenaki Tribal Gardens, recording these stories. So today I am going to be reading the story How We Got Stars, as told and written by Carolyn Black Hunt. When the world was still new, the night sky did not look as it does now. The sky was empty and as dark as the deepest hole. The only light that was available came from Grandmother Moon. But Grandmother Moon was not consistent. Sometimes she traveled throughout the daytime when Grandfather's sun was in the sky. Sometimes she traveled by herself during the nighttime hours. Sometimes she was in the night sky for only a few hours after Grandfather's sun went to bed. Sometimes she was only there in the hours just before he awoke and rose. Some nights she only showed part of her face. The pale light she gave was diminished. And sometimes the cloud people covered the night sky like a heavy blanket and blocked Grandmother Moon's light. This made it very difficult for the animals who went about their business during the night hours. These creatures did not have the gift of fire, and so they depended heavily upon Grandmother Moon. They never knew when or how much light that they would have to work by at any given night. Some nights Grandmother Moon was very helpful to them. Sometimes she was not, and they were left to stumble around in the dark, bumping into one another, tripping over things that they had a much harder time than those creatures who went about their business in the daylight hours. One night, when Grandmother Moon went to bed shortly after Grandfather's sun, the night creatures got together and requested a meeting with Gluskomba. They told him of all the troubles that they had when Grandmother Moon withheld the force of her light during the nighttime hours. They told him of how difficult it was to do what they needed to survive and how their children and their elderly suffered for it. They begged Gluskomba to go and tell Grandmother Moon that she needed to be more consistent, more dependable, the way Grandfather's sun was during the daytime hours. Gluskomba listened patiently to all the night creatures, what they had to say before he made his reply. I understand the troubles that arise from Grandmother Moon's unpredictability. However, she is not one whom you can tell what to do. She is very independent-minded and proud. She likes to come and go as she pleases. While she will listen to the problems this creates, she is not one to change her ways. Even I have no power over her. She must be approached in a very delicate way. But Gluskomba, the night creatures cried, something must be done. We are made for the nighttime and there is no space in the daytime for us in the world. She must be made to understand this. The lives of all of us depend on it. But there was no way to make Grandmother Moon do anything she did not wish. Gluskomba felt badly that he could not give the night creatures the answers they wanted and needed. If only there was some way to coax Grandmother Moon to spend more time in the night sky. But how? Gluskomba did not know. but he was determined to find the solution. So Gluskomba set about traveling the lands, listening to the complaints and concerns of the night creatures far and wide. He hoped that together with the night creatures, they would come up with a workable solution. But no idea presented itself. As Gluskomba traveled the lands, he found himself in the deep forests of the Dawnland. Even here, the trees overhead grew so thick that Grandfather's light had a hard time penetrating to the ground. As he stood looking about, he noticed a tiny flash of white on the ground to his left. Curious, he walked over to where the flash had come from. Even though it had been small, it was quite bright for its size. He crouched down low and moved some of the ferns aside, and there was the source of the tiny light. It was a small white flower with 5 petals. And in the deep gloaming of the forest, its tiny light shone forth. After crouching down to look at this tiny flower, Gluskomba noticed another one, and another, and another. As he stood and turned, he saw that even though they grew by themselves in the deep green light, that they were everywhere. As he looked about, the tiny flowers began to give him an idea to draw Grandmother Moon out into the night sky. He explained to each flower that his idea was, and asked each one if they wished to help the night creatures. He picked those that wanted to help and placed each one gently into his magical travel bag. Even so, he made sure to pick only every other blossom so that there were more than enough left behind that it did not endanger their existence. After many, many days of hunting through the deep forests for the bright little flowers, he felt he finally had enough to start his project. Gluskomba traveled out of the deep forest to the nearest mountain peak. Here he made himself as tall as the mountains. But he decided it was not tall enough. Making himself smaller again, he went to the highest peak in the area, to the mountain that called itself the greatest mountain. He climbed to its very top, then made himself as tall as it was. Again. But he was still not tall enough. Again, he made himself small and came down from the mountain peak. From here, he headed west to its cousins, the one called He with the Snowy Forehead. Gluskomba then climbed this very high mountain. Once he reached its peak, he made himself as tall as the Snowy Forehead. But he decided, that even being this tall was not high enough. As he made himself small again, he heard a voice call out to him. Gluskomba, why are you climbing mountains to make yourself very tall and then very small? The voice belonged to Azabon the raccoon. Gluskomba invited Azabon to come and sit with him and told him of the problems of the night creatures and what he was trying to do to make things better for them. When Gluskomba had finished, Azaban replied. "You must go to the land in the west. My cousin Coyote lives there and says that there are mountains even higher than those here in the Dawnland. To get there, you must cross the great river that splits our lands. On the other side of this is the great open grassy plain. Cross this too. Only then will you find these mountains so high that nothing grows on their peaks." Gluskoma thanked Azaban for his advice. Then he set forth, following Grandfather Sun's westerly path across the sky. He walked to the great eastern forest until he came to the river that split the lands in two. He crossed this mighty river to the place of the endless grasses. He crossed the great grassy place until he could see the stony peaks of the far western mountains. It took him many days of walking to reach them. Then he picked out the highest peak and began to climb. When he reached the very top of the highest peak, Grandfather Sun and Grandmother Moon were both still in the sky. It would be several hours before the darkness came, and Grandmother Moon was traveling with her husband this day, so it would be a very dark night. Gluskomba decided that he would rest a while from his long journey. He sat down with a large rock against his back. The heat of Grandfather Sun light and the high, thin air made Gluskomba drowsy. Soon, he was fast asleep. While Gluskomba had spent the day climbing the high peaks, the cousin of Azaban was busy going about his business. He was working hard to find a dinner for his hungry children, but none of the birds or animals he ate were cooperating with him that day. And so he traveled further and further from his home, looking for someone who would not mind being his dinner. Soon, his wanderings brought him to the footprints, the likes of which he had never seen. They looked like long animal tracks, but were made by 2 feet, like a bird, rather than an animal's 4 feet. Curiosity overcame his hunger, and Coyote began to follow these strange tracks. The tracks took him from the edge of the great grassy place up the slopes of the high, stony mountains. As Grandfather Sun and Grandmother Moon were reaching towards their evening resting place, Coyote came to the top of the stony mountain that the tracks led up. As he came around a rock, he heard a snort and a grumble, like somebody was sleeping. Ever cautious, Coyote did not call out. Instead, he slowly peeked around the rock to see who or what had made the sounds. Then he saw the strangest being. It was like an elk, but thin, like a ferret. Its face and limbs were free of any fur or feathers. Yet fur grew very long from the top of its head, and its ears were on the sides of its head instead of on the top, where everyone knew that is where you kept your ears, and its eyes were closed. This being was sound asleep. As Coyote looked at this strange sleeping creature, he remembered his cousin Azaban and the stories he told of a being who looked just like this. The being's name was Gloopy. No, that wasn't right. Clompy? No, Clumbooba. Wait. Gluscomba. That was it. Coyote was looking at Gluscomba. Then Coyote remembered the stories that his cousin had told him about Gluscomba. He was a magic being who could make himself big or small. He could travel very far in one day, and he always had a travel bag with him, a magic travel bag. A travel bag that was always filled with fine food that Gluscomba's grandmother named Nugomi would make for him that he liked to share liberally. And with that thought, Coyote's hunger came back to him in full force. What a dilemma for Coyote. Here he was with a generous Gluscomba who always had mighty fine things to eat. Things that he enjoyed sharing with many friends. But Gluscomba was asleep. And Coyote was hungry now. Who knew when Gluscomba would awaken? He did not want to be rude and awaken his visitor from the east, but he needed to get some food to eat and more to bring back to his family. What a dilemma. It was then that Coyote noticed the travel bag laying on the ground beside Gluscomba. It looked nice and fat. No doubt filled with delicious food. Coyote grumbled even louder. And Coyote began to think to himself. He thought if Gluscomba was awake, he would surely offer some food to Coyote to eat and bring home to his hungry children. If he knew that he had been asleep while Coyote sat there hungry, waiting for him to awaken, he would feel mighty bad about it. Perhaps if Coyote only took the food that Gluscomba would have given him had he been awake, now he could thank Gluscomba for it later. That way, Coyote would not have been rude for waking him, and Gluscomba would not feel bad for making Coyote wait while he slept. Yes, that is what he would do. It was the only thing that made sense. And so, Coyote crept up close to Gluscomba very quietly, so not to waken him. As the last light faded from the sky, Coyote gently picked up the strap of Gluscomba's travel bag to pull it away from him so that the sounds of Coyote eating would not wake him up. But as Coyote began to pull the bag away, his brain filled with the overpowering thoughts of food. His stomach growled again, and he made the decision for him. He took a firmer hold of the travel bag strap, turned, and began racing down the stony mountain in the darkness. As he ran down the mountain, the travel bag snagged on something and ripped. It ripped open as Coyote ran. All the tiny white flowers that Gluscomba had picked flew out of the bag and scattered across the empty sky in a big, messy smear. Whoosh! It was at that moment that Gluscomba's eyes fluttered open. Expecting to see total darkness, he was surprised that he could faintly see himself. How could this be? He looked down for his travel bag, but it was not there. He looked up into the sky and saw all the little flowers just strewn about in a big mess. Looking down again, he saw some tracks in the dirt, tracks that showed someone dragging his travel bag away. In an instant, he knew it had to be the cousin Azaban. Trouble rang strongly in the blood of that one's family. Gluskoma stood up and looked down the mountain. And sure enough, there, farther down the slope, the ripped travel bag hanging from his mouth, the last of the flowers, fluttering to the ground. "Coyote!" Gluskoma bellowed. Coyote jumped and looked at Gluskoma's angry face. "What have you done? Do you have any idea how long it took me to collect all those tiny little flowers? I was going to make a beautiful pattern in the sky to entice Grandmother Moon to spend more time in the nighttime sky. So that the night creatures could see what they're doing. Look what you've done! What a mess! Now that they're up there, I cannot retrieve them and make them look beautiful. Just wait until Grandmother Moon sees what had happened to the night sky. She'll be furious with me. What have you got to say for yourself?" Coyote looked up from Gluskoma to the night sky and back at Gluskoma. Once again, that stomach of his had gotten him into trouble. There was no way to his way out of this one either. He was in deep. Coyote felt so bad about what he had done that he dropped the travel bag, turned his face to the sky, and began to cry. To this day, the great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Coyote's great-grandchildren still feel guilty when they look up into the night sky. They will sit together and cry, "Oh! Oh!" As for Grandmother Moon, well, she was not very pleased, but she understood. She understood the reason behind it all and made an effort to be in the sky a little more often. And the flowers, they are what we now call the Milky Way. It is seen best on a night when Grandmother Moon does not come out, and they give just enough light to see what one is doing at night.
Ow.